Hello, I'm LaTanya Turner. As you've just seen, many of Tennessee's youth are coming of age misinformed and unprepared to make responsible decisions regarding their sexuality. To help us begin a community conversation around these issues, we invited 4 panelists into the studio. They were Dr. Mary Romano from the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Health at Monroe Carell Jr. Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt, Mark Bloodworth, HIV Education Consultant for the Tennessee Department of Education, Deanna Allen, Director of Adolescent Health Programs with the Metro Public Health Department, and Melissa Bell, whose story of becoming pregnant as a teenager is featured in the documentary. We also invited a studio audience to participate with their questions and comments. How do you as parents start that conversation? Raise your hand if you have been proactive and had that conversation. Tell me how you got started and what age.
Let's see, I do have a 27-year-old. I have 4 actually, and my oldest is 27, and just very open and honest. As one of the instructors on the video said, you know, there's no reason why we can't say penis or vagina. And I think that when you open up a conversation like that with a child, I think that it gives them the ability to say, I can talk about this. It makes them feel a little more welcoming and a little more comfortable with what they want to express, whether it be a concern of them or something that they're encountering at school or peer pressure altogether.
What age is the best age?
I think as soon as children start asking any kind of question, and actually I tell parents that they are sexuality educators right from the time the child is a toddler. They're teaching about sexuality, not sexual intercourse, but about sexuality. We are trying to educate teens, but there are not a lot of ways we try to help parents talk to children. And one of the programs that I represent is through the churches. My denomination has a program for 5th and 6th graders that works also with their parents to do some educating of the children, but to help the parents feel enabled and equipped to talk with their children, and then to have an experience where they are together such that they each feel like the other one may have some insights or have some questions and can continue that conversation long after the weekend experience that they have. Okay. I think that's really important for the churches to be proactive about claiming this part of our lives.
Very good point. And so you also are saying that find those teachable moments. Yes. and don't ignore them. How many people have seized on an opportunity where your child raised a topic and you saw it as a teachable moment and you were able to really take that and make it be an effective way to have this conversation? Anyone want to describe that experience to me? How many people just put the books on the table like we heard in the story and said, okay, they're there. Raise your hand, be honest. Yes, you did? Do you want to make a comment? Hold on, got the mic to you.
You know, it's put the books out, but it's have the discussion, it's find the teachable moments, it's all of that, because what we're talking about is life. And so if the more parents, people can treat whole subject of sexuality, which is different from sexual intercourse, which is what we need to make the distinction for adults in, because the minute many adults hear sex, they think of sexual acts versus just being sexual beings. And so I think the discussion of sexuality is from birth to death, you know.
It needs to be a holistic approach, it sounds like what you're saying. How do you start that conversation? Let me ask one of our panelists. How does a parent start that conversation? Deanna, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, I think you've already touched on it. It's identifying those teachable moments. They're all over the place, from the time that the child is a baby through toddler stage, through kind of middle school and tween years, and certainly into the high school and adolescent years. I actually want to piggyback on the previous comment about the faith-based community really taking ownership and taking charge of our whole person development. And I'm really glad that you said that. Very much glad that you said that, because there are lots of communities that are interested in tackling this issue and trying to understand how to do it, not really sure how to get started, what's the best approach. I think that there are lots of lessons that we have learned along the way, and where we find good models that other communities are doing just that and are being effective. We should be having those broad conversations as a community, learning from the best practices of what's already going on and helping other communities do the same thing.
Melissa, how do you think it would be most effective for a teenager to hear this conversation and get started conversing with a parent about this?
I think that honesty is really the most important part. My mom was one of those who, left books in my clean clothes hamper and I guess expected me to read them. And then I was just mostly, felt really uncomfortable to look at her the next day after she'd left. I don't know. It was just very uncomfortable.
Did you want your mother to have that conversation, or do you feel that there are other people that you needed to have that conversation with?
Now I really would have liked her to have that conversation with me. Then it was so uncomfortable. And every so often she would ask a question or two, and I think she was expecting me to have a dialogue with her. But I was so uncomfortable because it had never been brought up before that I mostly wanted to push it, under the rug as well. I think having that conversation with someone like my older sister, for instance, who was, I don't know, 6 years older than me, would have been a little bit more comfortable because it's not your parent. And then also, there were younger adults who were involved with my youth group who it probably would have been pretty beneficial to speak with as well. Any type of adult relationship, a mentor, somebody who's not necessarily my parent, would have been much easier, I think, on me.
Which is where I would say,
No, go ahead.
Use your child's, not to sort of pitch my own, but use your child's doctor, because I think to me, the first thing a parent can do is be totally honest and say, this is a totally awkward conversation for me and for you. And it's okay. I think parents feel like they have to go into that conversation as an expert. It's okay if you don't know the answer to a question that your child's asked, and it's okay if you say, oh my gosh, I'm dreading this conversation as much as you are, but we have to have it. And we talk about it with our patients in adolescent medicine clinic all the time, with parents, without parents. And I think, unfortunately, fortunately, teenagers are really healthy. So unfortunately, they don't go to the doctor a lot, and they kind of get dragged there kicking and screaming when the parent may say finds out they're having sex, and then all of a sudden, after not seeing their physician, it's a crisis. And if they go every year and say to the doctor, I want to talk to my kids about sex, are you talking, ask your kid's doctor, are you talking about this? They should be, and if they're not, that's a problem. And asking your physician to either have the conversation with you, have the conversation without you to allow them that comfort level, and then bringing in mom. I think that parents have to maintain a trust with their doctor and allow their child to have a relationship, so that's a huge tool that I think people very much underutilize.
We saw in the report how open parents are in the Netherlands, and if you'd stand, I'd like people to be able to see you. How real should parents be in this conversation?
A lot more real than most of them are. I think for a lot of people it would be really nice if it's not a sudden, oh crap, you're 13 now, we have to have the talk. If it's more of a continued thing throughout their life, then it's not a really awkward moment of, well, now suddenly we have to talk about sex and we've never talked about this before, so this is a little scary. And I think people make a really big deal out of it when it could be a lot easier. So more communication would be really nice.
Okay. So it needs to be a continued conversation. Mark, how do you have this conversation with a kindergartner, because your program has to be taught in kindergarten?
Yes.
And also have a conversation that's meaningful to an 11th or 12th grader. How do you approach it?
The kind of things that you would discuss in kindergarten are appropriate touch. If an adult or someone touches you in an area that doesn't make you feel comfortable, you need to tell a trusted adult. You need to go find someone that you can let them know that. Kindergartners should know that little boys shouldn't push little girls, and little girls shouldn't hit little boys. Those are respect issues. Those are the kind of things that kindergartners need to know about sex education. Of course, as you get older, they need more medically accurate information, and they also need to know about the emotions and everything that go along with it. It's not just plumbing, it's the other parts of it as well. So when you're talking about those they need psychological support as well as the medical information too. So we'll make sure we're doing that as well.
Dr. Romano, talking about kindergartners and what's appropriate and first grade, second grade, some people would think, you know, fifth grade, fourth grade, it's still too young maybe to get into more intimate conversations about intimacy. But developmentally, when do children become sexually mature?
So I think there's a difference between sexually mature, because if you really look at that, you mean for girls, when do they have their periods? When do they achieve menarche, which in theory makes them capable of reproduction? And we know, when we know that girls, the average age of menarche in girls in the United States is about 12 and a half. I think Dr. Callahan referenced that in the documentary. There's a difference between physical sexual maturity and emotional sexual maturity. And I think the thing that's been interesting about that brain research has been that even though sexual maturity may be happening earlier, physically, that brain development happens. You can start puberty at 9, you can start puberty at 15. Your brain doesn't physically develop and become capable of making those decisions, and it's based on time. It's a time factor. So I think we need to recognize girls that develop, girls inherently develop earlier than boys, naturally, and some girls certainly develop earlier than their peers. And those girls get attention that may be sexual, that may be inappropriate for their mental age as opposed to their physical appearance. So I think you need to have that conversation for 4th and 5th graders, perhaps not talking about sexual intimacy, but talking about respect, talking about what it means to have a relationship, touching upon sexual feelings, what you do with those sexual feelings. It's okay, I think Melissa mentioned that one of her interviews, it's okay to have those feelings and to not know what to do with them, but someone needs to talk to kids about that. But I think it is important to pay attention to girls that may develop, because we know that girls who develop earlier are at risk for earlier initiation of sexual activity, issues with self-esteem, which may result in earlier sexual activity. And so I think you have to probably pay some extra attention to those girls, because they may be getting sexual attention that they're not mentally able to handle. But I think respect and healthy relationships are an ongoing conversation that translate eventually into appropriate sexual relationships.
Anyone want to comment on what Dr. Romano said?
Kids start watching television at an extremely early age, and if you read about the number of sexual encounters, sexual messages that they're seeing every hour, that they're watching TV, you realize that the media is teaching them these things long before we start having these conversations. So 8 or 9 is sometimes too late. The earlier the better. The first time they start asking those questions, you just need to answer them age appropriately, and build on that, so as it was mentioned earlier, it is a lifelong conversation.
When you can use the media to your advantage. So, if you see a sexual, because I think teenagers love to give their opinion because they're always being told what to think and what to do. So I think teenagers love if someone's like, what do you think about that situation? So I think all those sexual messages and lyrics can be used to your advantage. That lyric was very sexual. Is that something you've ever thought of? Or I think using that and getting a teenager's opinion can be very good. You can sort of take a negative and spin it to a positive, and I think get a much better response from your teen by hearing what they think instead of telling them what you think. Because I think the tendency for sex is you should do this, you shouldn't do this, you should think this is, and getting that feedback I think goes a long way to empower teens to say, hey, mom and dad want to tell me stuff, but they also care what I think, and that makes me more engaged in the conversation.
Okay, I saw a question over here. Do you have a question?
Well, I was going to add, sorry. So part of it I absolutely think is the using moments, but then also taking those moments and turning them and saying, well, I've heard what you think. I hear that. Who do you hear that from? Why do you think that? And here's what I think, and here are our values. This is what I wish for you. This is what I hope for you, and taking it one step further. And remembering that it isn't just about sex. It's not just about two people and their bodies rubbing together. It's about relationships. It's about decision making. It's about confidence. It's about communication. And those things a person absolutely can start talking about as soon as a toddler is moving around. Like, how do you respect another person? How do we make a good decision? How do we communicate about that? Those are all parts of this too. When we talk about sexuality, it's all of that. So,
yes. Hold on just a second.
I think the other thing that's important in talking is sex is not just sex. Sex is health. And hopefully when you talk to your children about the foods you eat, the exercise you have, sex is just another topic. I think sometimes we make sex too glamorous or, ooh, we don't want to talk about it, but it's really about your kids' health. And how do you just talk to your kids about that whole range? So if we can do more of that, I think that will help it make it more comfortable and more normal.
And yet, a lot of children hear the most about this topic in school or from the media, as we've already established, because a lot of parents are intimidated about this conversation. Deanna, how much of this is really done through the schools for the first time for some of these youngsters, or maybe the only exposure? And how effective are those programs at really educating children with what they need to know? There are limits, aren't there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think something to keep in mind that we really didn't have an opportunity to highlight in the documentary are the cultural differences. So for some cultural groups, that family life and sexuality education, that lifetime wellness class, may indeed be the first time that we're having those conversations where an adult is having that conversation with a young person. There are other circumstances where it's not the first time that I've heard this information, but it may be the first time I've heard the medically accurate information, and I have a clear sense of vocabulary and a better sense of understanding. I do think that parents certainly do try, and we have community who do try, but what the school system helps to provide is a set of standards that all young people should have this information as a part of being a healthy young person. It's as a part of their academic growth and development, that they know their bodies and they know how they relate to the world around them in relationships, in friendships, and as a part of their future as being a healthy and a whole young person.
Mark, why don't you talk a little bit about that too, since your programs really deal with what's happening in the classroom a lot?
Our program, we have a cadre of trainers that we've developed through the Department of Education. It's based out of MTSU. It's called Tennessee Talks, and that stands for Teaching Activities That Lead to Knowledge and Safety. And what we're trying to do is work with the teachers and give them some tools that they can take back to the classroom to teach these concepts in a more fun and active and interactive kind of way, where the kids are more open and we'll talk about them more.
There are limits of what can be addressed in the classroom.
Right.
What are the limits? How far can this conversation go?
There, in the standards, it discusses that there should be a discussion on the various types of contraceptives, but a lot of times I don't think it's in the lifetime wellness standards, but I don't think it gets discussed. Like I was saying, some of the school systems are very open and will do condom demonstrations and work with them, but then you've got those teachers also that say the V word, the P word, and are not comfortable, and unfortunately that impacts their students because they're not getting the education, not getting the information they need to make healthier choices.
You mentioned comprehensive sex education. What is comprehensive sex education? Who wants to help us understand that a little better?
I mean, I think that a lot of times people think abstinence only educate, like that somehow you either teach sex ed or you teach abstinence, and I think what's important is that the conversation can absolutely be the fact that abstinence is the only way to make sure you absolutely do not get pregnant or get an STD, but there are options if you choose to not be abstinent. And I think sometimes that push for abstinence education gets translated as somehow that comprehensive sex ed will exclude that. And I think, comprehensive sexual education has to include contraceptive options, and I think has to include it's not just will you or won't you have sex. I think a huge conversation is what is going to factor into your decision to become sexually active. The emotional factors, the medical factors, the risks, and all of those things have to be talked about by teachers. And I mean, I think it's all of it. I think to go back to sort of what you said about contraception, it takes teenagers an average of 18 months to get in front of a doctor to discuss birth control once they become sexually active. Most teen pregnancies occur within the first 6 months of initiating sexual activity. So there is a huge window of risk for teens. And I think that whole, if there's a problem, then we'll talk about contraception is absolutely it should be, let's talk about all this stuff because let's get started on this path before there's a problem. I think I apologize, I don't remember your name, you had mentioned it, you have to be proactive and not be like, ooh, my kid's having sex, let's do something about it. It should be, let's have a conversation about what we're gonna do so that you know what you should do before that decision gets made.
Melissa, do you want to add
There's
something?
so much that goes into the decision about, staying, whatever, abstinence or not. Whether you're going to have sex or not, there's so much that goes into that, and having a trusted adult, if it's your teacher, it's your parent, it's your coach, it's your whatever, that you can kind of walk through that with is super important. And like a couple of you have mentioned, also the discussion about relationships and respect, and what is healthy as far as that goes and what really isn't, and a way to define what you're personally comfortable with in a sexual relationship or even a non-sexual relationship, and where those boundaries lie for you and how you got there. We've already established that education from the church or different religious groups is important. And the values that you may hold personally are going to affect how you make that decision, and that just, I think, makes it that much more important to incorporate that into your education and into where that decision-making comes into play.
Well, culturally, we do see sort of this line of demarcation. It's abstinence or it's comprehensive, if you want to misuse that term. Even if a student abstains, a child abstains to, say, the age of 20, then many of them, a large percentage, go on to have premarital sex. And isn't there a higher pregnancy rate in that age group? So in abstaining and teaching abstinence, is it kind of setting up children for not being well prepared and informed later, even if they practice abstinence?
It's not necessarily setting up young people as they move into kind of young adulthood in their 20s to be more sexually irresponsible. I don't think that's the way to look at the issue. To look at the issue from a youth development standpoint, from a public health system standpoint, is we support young people making the best decisions for themselves, period. And so ways to do that, develop the systems around the young people to provide them with the support, that they have multiple caring adults that they can talk to, that they have the medically accurate information, and support the decision that they make.
I also think you have to look at how you define sex, because I think when you're saying these comments, you mean intercourse. And certainly another sexual behavior is oral sex. And that's certainly something that I would even say a lot of teenagers use to, well, I'm going to have oral sex, but I'm not having sex, so this is okay, this is safe, I'm not getting pregnant. And I think you can look at anal sex, you can look at all of those things the same way. So there's intercourse and there's sexual activity of all different types. And I think teenagers need to know that they all have medical risks in terms of you can get STDs from all forms of sex, all of those forms of sexual activity, and there's emotional consequences. I think you had mentioned something about sort of what you get out of sex. I think oral sex has been sort of used as I'm going to do this to get away with not having sex, maybe to satisfy a relationship or to stay safe, and there's emotional consequences to that as well that nobody mentions. Because I think, you just hear, oh, she's not having sex, done. There are all those things to consider, especially if you look at people that are in, gay and lesbian, that's another kind of sex that you need to talk about, and those risks and the implications of that as well.
Okay. Yes, last question from the audience. Hold on.
No problem.
The only piece I would add to that too is that there are behaviors that are much lower risk that a person can choose and stay there. So someone could cuddle, someone can hug, people can make out. There are all these things that people skip, and we go dating or at a party or whatever to sex. And so we miss all this other stuff in the middle, and we aren't teaching teens about that and how to make small decisions, smaller steps, and how you say, okay, this is my boundary right now, and maybe I would consider other boundaries, but right now I'm going to stop at, we're going to make out and dance. How do you, part of it is also expanding the conversation to say, there are risks with these behaviors. There are some behaviors that are a little bit safer, and you can still have some fun.
So I would like to know from each of you, because we're almost out of time, maybe one thing that you would like to be the takeaway today for us to improve these numbers that we are reporting on in this program. Let's start with you, Dr. Romano.
One thing, okay. Communication is the most important tool parents, doctors, schools, everybody that comes into contact with teens have. I think using every opportunity that you have with a teenager to communicate anything informative. I mean, obviously the topic of this conversation is sexuality and sex education, but constantly be conveying to your teen how you feel about everything, both the facts and the values, and just that way it's not this one only conversation. If it's just an ongoing communication about how you think and what your values are, your teen will always hear those messages, even through the rolled eyes and, oh my gosh, stop talking, Mom. I mean, I think they're listening and they're hearing you, so just keep saying it.
Mark?
I think my main point is that sexuality is not just plumbing. You know, there's so much more to it. There's the emotion, the respect, like we've been talking about. There's so much more to the spectrum of sexuality than just plumbing. And sometimes I think when parents hear that term, that's the first thing they think about is the act and the parts, and not necessarily all the respect and emotions and other things that go along with that.
Okay. Deanna?
There are resources and best practices available. We're not the only community who has gone through this and who's learned lessons. We should take the best practices, the evidence that we know that works, replicate it in culturally appropriate ways, and support our young people in making healthy decisions.
Okay. And Melissa?
This type of education is not just one person's job. This is going to take our churches, our schools, our parents, involvement from everybody to really make it happen and be effective. And like you just said, I mean, looking at what research shows is gonna, I mean, it's gonna help. It's gonna do it for us.
Okay. Well, we've covered a very big topic in a very short amount of time. I want to thank everyone in our audience for being here. I certainly want to thank our panelists. You can learn more about the children's health crisis in Nashville by going to wnpt.org/children's health. Stay tuned to NPT for continued coverage of this issue. And we want to hear what you think. Write to us at tv8@wnpt.org or call our viewer comment line 259-9326. Thank you for watching.
Major funding for NPT Reports, Children's Health Crisis, has been provided by the Healthways Foundation, addressing the critical issues of children's health and public education, the Monroe Carell Jr. Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt, the Nashville Healthcare Council, Baptist Healing Trust, fostering access to compassionate healthcare in Middle Tennessee. Additional support provided by the Orrin H. Ingram Fund and by members of NPT. Thank you.